Hi, I am at a public school today subbing, and this is considered my planning period. So I found this book, and I just fell in love with it right away. It's called Wackiest White House Pets. And I don't know how much we'll get read from the book today, but I thought whatever we get will be interesting because I already read it, or most of it. It says throughout the centuries, around 400 pets have lived in the White House. Some were ordinary, some were not. You might wonder how all of these creatures found their way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, and that is the address of the White House. A few pets arrived with their president. A handful simply wandered into the White House lawn. One even turned up in the mail. But the wildest, wackiest pets were often gifts from kings, queens, and foreign officials. When even the White House's 132 rooms couldn't contain a restless elephant or a high-jumping wallaby, they were donated to Washington's nearby zoo. But most pets remained to live with the president's family. Years ago, presidential pets were also practical. The White House lawn was home to farm animals such as cows, horses, sheep, goats, and chickens. Hear the bell? Students better be in their seats or they're marked tardy. These hardworking pets gave milk, butter, and eggs, trimmed the grass, and provided transportation for the first families. Times change, but one thing remains the same. Like us, presidents and their families love their pets, no matter how wacky, because after all, pets make a house a home. So, do you know who our first president was? It was George Washington. Do you see what horse that he has a horse? I guess I said that. George Washington was the first president of the United States. He had to decide what the job of president would be. Since there wasn't one before, that no one knew what that would take place. They just knew they did not want a king, right? After the Revolutionary War, General Washington was so popular that some people wanted him to be king. Washington helped America grow from 13 separate colonies into one free nation. The father of his country needed to be as stubborn as a mule. So it's no surprise that he created a line of super mules. So a mule is a cross between a jackass and a mare. The King of Spain wanted to help the president, so he offered Washington two of his best jackasses. Of all the presidents, Washington was the best horseman. His horses were the most pampered pets in the country. Before riding, the president insisted the horses be polished from head to hoof. Do you know what a hoof is? It's a foot. Even their teeth were brushed. He probably didn't want them to lose their teeth as he had. By the age of 57, he only had one tooth left and wore a set of false ones. So he only had one of his teeth left. And that is why it's so important to take care of our teeth. We only get one set, right? Washington had almost 40 hounds. He treated them like members of the family. Each dog had a name to fit its personalities, like Sweet Lips, Tippler, or Madame Moose. A huge French hound named Vulcan had an appetite as big as he was. One time, Vulcan sniffed a freshly cooked ham on Martha Washington's dinner table. Opening his great jaws, Vulcan grabbed the ham and ran. Safe inside his kennel, the hungry hound gorged himself on the president's dinner. The first pets never lived on the White House grounds, but they had a good reason. The White House hadn't even been built yet. New York City was our nation's first capital. Then it went to Philadelphia, and then it went to Washington, D.C., where it is today. Do you remember the address? 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C. Okay, on to a next president. And this is Thomas Jefferson. He had a very brilliant, curious mind, and before he became president, he wrote the Declaration of Independence. As president, he doubled the size of America by buying the massive Louisiana Territory. In 1804, Jefferson sent the explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark. So it was the Lewis-Clark expeditions, way out into the Wild West. One day, an especially large crate arrived at the White House. Growling and scratching sounds came from inside. The famous explorers had sent Jefferson 2 grizzly cubs. The animal-loving president liked the young grizzlies so much he decided to build them a cage on the south lawn so they could be seen by the public. Jefferson often joined his growing cubs for walks around the garden. Jefferson's enemies made fun of his choice of pets. They called the White House grounds the President's the President's Bear Garden. Jefferson was a true Democrat. The author of the Declaration of Independence not only believed in equal rights for people, he believed in equal rights for animals too. That included his feathered friends. I could unpack that a little, but I'm not going to. The president owned several mockingbirds. Dickie, his favorite, was allowed to fly free in the president's study. Jefferson and Dickie often performed duets. The president played the violin while Dickie whistled along. One of his many tricks was pecking bits of food from between Jefferson's lips. That sounds gross to me. The amazing mockingbird could imitate almost any sound. He could even bark like a dog. At bedtime, Jefferson's constant companion hopped up on the White House stairs after him, one step at a time. That was Thomas Jefferson. Now this one says it's the most talkative pet. What do you think that might be? What's a real talkative pet? Think about it. This pint-sized president didn't look much like a great leader. But you can't tell a president by his height. At 5 feet 4 inches, James Madison was our shortest president. Despite his protests, Madison is known as the father of the Constitution, the most influential thinker behind the government we still use today. The short, white-haired president and his much younger, blooming wife made an odd-looking couple. But an even stranger-looking pair was the First Lady Dolly Madison and her pet parrot. Whoever said birds of a feather flock together must have had the president's colorful wife and her equally colorful green parrot in mind. A popular White House hostess, Dolly, was called the Queen of Washington City. She presided at the first inaugural ball, and her talking parrot was the star attraction at her many elegant parties. Wearing a tall feathered turban, Dolly often entertained with her famous parrot perched on her shoulder. In fact, Dolly was the White House hostess even before her husband became president. At a party during Jefferson's administration, Dolly introduced her guests to a new dessert, ice cream. It's hard to think of ice cream as being new. I like ice cream so much. I eat it almost every day. During the War of 1812, the British invaded America. When British troops set fire to the White House, Dolly was forced to flee with just a handful of possessions. Fortunately, the First Lady was cool in a crisis. She didn't panic. With just a minute to spare, Dolly decided what to take: the Declaration of Independence, a famous portrait of George Washington, and last but not least, yep, you guessed it, her adored parrot. Parrots live long lives, and Dolly's parrot was no exception. The celebrated parrot outlived both the president and the First Lady. Now this one's going to be hard to believe, okay? President John Quincy Adams had lots of ideas about improving things like roads, canals, and schools. He had a hard time getting his improvements made. No one would say he had an easy time in the White House. Maybe that's why he was so understanding when an alligator came to visit. In the summer of 1826, the alligator arrived with the president's good friend, the Marquis de Lafayette. The French war hero was the first celebrity to visit the White House, and the alligator was the first pet of its kind to ever slither across the White House steps. Now later on, President Herbert Hoover's son was given 2 alligators. For 2 months, the green, scaly, sharp-toothed pet lived in the White House giant East Room. Visitors who wandered in got a big surprise. They came running out with alligator jaws snapping at their heels. Like his reptilian guest, Adams was a good swimmer. Early each morning, the president went skinny dipping in the Potomac River. After a sad farewell ceremony, Lafayette and his alligator finally departed. The president and first lady waved goodbye as they watched their visitor's green tail slide out of sight. "See you later, alligator." The Adams family also had the smallest pets in the White House. First Lady Louisa Adams raised silkworms and fed her tiny pets mulberry leaves. The silkworms thanked her by spinning the finest silk, which she wound herself. It was then sewn into luxurious gowns for the fashionable First Lady. One more. Tiniest dog. Franklin Pierce didn't really want to be president. His friends nominated him. Tragedy followed him into the White House. Just before his inauguration, his 3rd son died in a railroad accident. Sad. It was a difficult time for our country, too. Everyone was arguing about slavery. Tensions between the North and the South were increasing. By the end of Pierce's term, the nation was hurtling toward the Civil War. Perhaps the president took small comfort in his pocket-sized pet. Two tiny slave dogs had sailed all the way from the Orient to America, to Commodore Matthew Perry's flotilla. The U.S. had just opened trade with Japan. Perry had brought lots of other presents from Japan, but the president only had eyes for the diminutive dogs. It's easy to see why. One of the dogs stayed at the White House, but Pierce gave the other to Jefferson Davis. Davis would later become the president of the Confederacy. His new dog, named Bonin, was so tiny he could sit on a saucer. So here's your teacup, and here's your saucer, the little plate that sits under a teacup. With the head the size of a bird's and large popped-out eyes, the bite-sized pup traveled in style through Washington's high society, tucked into Davis's pocket. That's how small this little dog was. Can you imagine? Well, I hope you enjoyed this book. Really enjoyed it. Wackiest White House Pet. And I think we'll be doing a to be continued.